Joe Hayes.
Well, the question was that if the USA has unregulated, an unregulated internet, allowing big corporations to charge other big corporations.
Yes, I mean, the latest is that, for example, Netflix had to pay extra to various different networks in order for their traffic to increase in speed.
And the question is, if they do that, will what the European Union does make a difference?
Yeah.
Well, quite frankly, I don't know, but I would guess that what the EU does will make a difference, because the European Union is actually at the moment the largest market in the world by quite a narrow margin, but it is actually the largest market in economic terms, and it has more consumers than the USA has by a long way, although they're not quite as wealthy individually. So I think the European Union should legislate for what it thinks is right, and there is negotiation going on for a trade agreement with the USA at the moment, and obviously if we negotiate from a position of a principled stand on what we think is right, then we're more likely to get something acceptable than if we just sort of collapse and say, oh dear, you know, the mighty Netflix must win. I think that the principle of the ALDE group is correct, that we should ensure that at the retail end there is no difference to consumers. I haven't heard of pay-as-you-go charges being affected by this, and if that is a problem, then there'll have to be consumer legislation by the appropriate regulator.
Okay, are there any questions on that very quickly before we move on? Okay, let's move on to the next subject. So the next subject is surveillance. And we'll start with Vicky Ford. What is your position on the UK's mass surveillance programmes as revealed by Edward Snowden?
Well, I think that on the whole it's been revealed by a lot of people so far that it wasn't quite as mass surveillance as you've suggested, okay, with the language. I do, however, think that it has been important to have a new look at data protection and how your data is used. Again, there's a huge amount of detail that's gone into a discussion here. If you look at where we were under the last Labour government, when they had that you could be detained for 72 hours without even having a lawyer, so that had gone sort of too far against the individual. Then you come back and now you want to have another look again against the data, individuals' protection on privacy and online privacy especially. There's been a huge amount of work that's happened. There's been two pieces of European law through the Parliament. One is a data protection regulation, which I voted in favour of. Another one is a directive, which I didn't vote in favour of. The regulation looks at how businesses are using my data and how my data can be shared with others. The directive started to set some quite specific language about how our authorities, police authorities, etc., could work with other countries, and it looks as if the Parliament's changes to that would have made it very difficult to have some of our anti-terrorism works. So that, as a result, has got blocked because the national governments won't sign up to it. So it's been one of those cases where the Parliament's sort of gone too far, and therefore we will end up getting no area work in this area. So we've needed to have new laws. There needs to be a better look at data protection, but again, the Parliament seems to have gone too far in some of what they're asking our authorities to do. I mean, one example was the Parliament's changes would say that you needed to notify a criminal before you could start looking at them. And actually, if you've got the court order, if you've got the approval to start watching what they're doing for anti-terror laws, you don't then want to tell them that you're actually looking at them. But there have to be very strong barriers as well.
Andrew Boswell.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to underestimate what the Snowden revelations meant. And it really does mean that the intelligence authorities have access to every piece of information that we use on the internet.
No, they don't.
Potentially they do.
They don't.
That's exactly what they have. If you look at the Tempora system, that is actually tracking every piece of internet traffic which goes out of the fibre across the Atlantic. Now, that information, all the information is kept for 3 days, and then the metadata, then what's called metadata is kept, which basically is all the information about who a message is from, who it's going to, where it was sent, and all that. And that information is kept basically in perpetuity and can be accessed. Basically, what the technology, where we're at with the technology is that it's possible now to store absolutely huge amounts of information and to search it. Now, of course, it's not surveilling every individual, but the potential is there to do it, and that's the point. That the intelligence authorities have got the.
But they're not legally allowed to do it, and that's why we've tightened up the law.
I don't think the law's been tightened up at all, really. The current law, the REPA law, is over 10 years old, and it's before the current technology was there. And if you look at the Home Affairs report last week, they're also saying that there's very little scrutiny by the UK Parliament of the intelligence services. So we're both failing in terms of not having strong enough law, which is way behind where the technology is, and not actually having effective scrutiny within Parliament. And you know, that is a very dangerous situation to be in. And this isn't so much in Europe, I'm not talking about it so much from a European point of view, but from a national point of view, I think it's absolutely imperative that we get on top of that and we start putting basically the legal mechanisms in to catch up with where the technology is and the scrutiny mechanisms of our intelligence services. And then we'll be in a much better situation to actually know what the level of surveillance is. I mean, at the moment, it's not a matter of it doesn't exist. It's we don't know the extent of it. And it's not until we're actually scrutinising those bodies and really finding out what's going on that we're in a position to know that. And I do think the EU has an important place to set a European legislation on it across Europe as well.
Which we've done with the data protection.
Yes, and hopefully,
so
but unfortunately, you just said that some of the national governments.
No, that's under the directive, not on the So the regulation covers how your information can be used. The directive talks about issues on how the policing works, which is unfortunate that some of the governments won't sign up to what some of the Parliament's changes were because it's now gone almost too far on the side of the terrorist instead.
Well,
because you've got to have a balance.
There is a balance there, but what I'm saying is we haven't got there yet, and the legislation is behind, and we do have the UK often not signing up to things from.
That's not fair.
That's a large. We haven't got the controls over our own intelligence services, and that's very clear. It's very clear what's going on.
I'll let you debate this point in a sec. I just want to hear from Joe Hayes first as well. So.
Well, what I think of the UK's mass surveillance programme, as revealed by Edward Snowden, is that it's very doubtful whether it's legal. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which my party support the whole of the Convention on Human Rights very strongly. That's another reason why we should stay in the European Union, which is signed up to them. Article 8 gives the right to privacy for your private life and your home and your correspondence, and I would have thought that this traffic is part of your correspondence. And if you are just an ordinary person, sending an email to your granny in Scotland about what you had for dinner, why on earth should that metadata about that be concerned. The reason why it's being retained by these massive supercomputers that the Americans and we apparently have is basically because they can do it, and they're saving all this stuff because it might come in useful one day. And that seems to me very doubtful whether it can be justified on grounds of national security. And my party had believe me, where the activists like me are not by any means signed up to everything that the National Coalition does. And one thing that we were very upset about is that there's a new provision that's been put into the rules of court for the courts of England and Wales, where any of us can end up as a claimant or a defendant, which enables the courts to hear evidence in the absence of one party. And that was all pushed through before the Snowden revelations, and in retrospect I believe that the reason why the security services were so keen on it was that they wanted to continue to conceal where they were getting information from in certain cases, and that was because they wanted to conceal this entire mass programme. And Edward Snowden has done us all a great service by letting ordinary people know exactly what the government is doing. I mean, ordinary Americans who are not, many of them, what I would call liberal in outlook, are absolutely aghast. I mean, even Tea Party types, aghast at what the government has been doing. They're fine with surveillance of, Middle Eastern terrorists, but when they realise that they are also having data being collected, then they are beginning to feel deeply unhappy about this. I think there's a gathering storm about this, and I can't really address the detail of what the European Parliament has been legislating about, because I've been too busy doing the day job, quite frankly. But I think that the European Union's 28 member states are very clearly committed to this notion of privacy, and we have got to find a better way than the UK government has currently got to supervising what the security services do. And I think really the security services, the way that they carry on the incredibly privileged way in which they have been snooping and spying, is really, once you're in government, they sort of sidle up to you and kind of flatter you with how important this knowledge is, and how important it is that you must not tell anybody else. I haven't been in it, but I can quite imagine that's how it's done. And I think that we need to, as a democratic country, kind of perfect our democracy, because we've come from a feudal system, we've come from a very much a system of undemocratic rule by the monarch and by a class-based system, and our democracy has never really been modernised in the full sense. I mean, why else do we have a House of Lords? So I think we've got way to go.
Okay.
Wow.
Are there any questions on internet surveillance?
Can I just comment on this? Because I think it's incredibly important that you realise that there is a balance between trying to protect society against criminal or terrorist activities, but also not abusing people's personal privacy. Okay? And when you've got very clearly, Edward Snowden showed some things which had gone too far one way. But when you've then got the heads of security services saying that this has massively endangered public safety, it's sort of swung back the other way again. Now, I'm worried, Joe, if you're number 2 on the Lib Dem list and you haven't looked at this package that went through, because this is, the obvious question that we were going to get tonight. So we have been doing a huge amount of work. It's 18 months of negotiation on things like the right to be forgotten, okay, making sure that that data is not kept on with you forever. And there is a lot about the right to be forgotten and to make sure that data can be taken away, and we support the right to redress, etc., etc. But at some point, you can't tell every criminal organisation they can wipe out their history. You have to have a balance on this, okay? And I think that's why actually you voted something which went for a balance on this, Joe, and that's what Andrew voted for, and I voted for in the data protection regulation. We voted for a lot of language on giving consent, okay, so that your data can't be used without consent. Now, actually, there's an awful lot of patient charities who think we've gone too far because they're looking at things like big trials into cancer research, and can anonymised data be shared? So if there's a research project going on at the moment, Million Woman Trial it's called, looking at breast cancer versus cancer screening services. And they're saying you wouldn't be able to run that trial because even though it's anonymised, pseudonymised data, it's gone too far, the legislation, that you wouldn't be able to get that sort of data for society now. Now, I don't think that's in our interest. I think there is a lot of details in these discussions. I want to make sure that data can be shared where appropriate. I think the Edward Snowden case showed that some things have gone too far, but Joe, it's not nearly as bad as you say either. So notification is good, right to be forgotten, yes, within balance, explicit consent, yes, but also there is some societal benefits. We need to look at new data laws for a new digital world, but we can't just have no sharing of information whatsoever. That would be dangerous as well.
Joe, do you have a reply to that you'd like to add?
Well, I agree there's got to be a balance, but the question is where is it to be struck, and I think that it has to be struck more in favour of privacy for the ordinary person.
And just briefly say that, to agree there has to be a balance, and the legislation is still in process. I don't think we have perfect legislation, but the key problem is also enforcement of that legislation. At the moment, we don't know what our security services are doing because we're not scrutinising them properly. And I come back to that, but we need greater parliamentary and other scrutiny of the services to know whether they're even following the law. It's all very well having the law, but if they're not following it, then we're all stuffed really on that.
You had a quick question at the back.
Yeah, my question is, my understanding of the sort of data protection data, so the striking down of the data extension directive that happened recently, that might impact on the storing of data for the police, but actually surveillance by GCHQ, the national security, so therefore isn't impacted by European laws. So actually, when you're saying that legislation will be able to control what's known in the field, that's not necessarily true, is it? Because we don't actually know all the legislation that determines how security services.
I think, the data protection regulation is how your data can be used. The directive, as I said, was about how the policing authorities work more. And your national authorities work a lot more. I'm all for sharing of data across borders, but this, for example, would have made it much more difficult for us to share data with third countries, and I think sometimes we need to do that. So some of the Parliament's language here went so extreme that that's why the national governments won't sign up to it, because they want to have a certain amount of national control as well. So it's a fine line, but if you're saying we will have to notify criminals every time before we're watching them, and if you're saying really huge restrictions on data sharing across the Atlantic, for example, I don't think that is acceptable for the British government, and that's why they won't sign up to it.
What about surveillance of ordinary citizens? I think what we're saying is where judicial oversight over surveillance.
There has to be protections against surveillance of individuals, okay? And I think that's what Snowden proved, that you need to make sure we have better protections for the digital world, which we've put in place.
So you think that the European legislation will impact on what GCHQ can do?
No, I'm saying there's been put in place more surveillance. And actually what you said about better scrutiny, you've heard lots of people this week saying let's bring them in front of the House of Commons. But I think that happens at the national level, okay? There could have been a data protection directive as well, But sadly, a lot of national governments won't sign up to it because it's gone too far the other way.
Are there any other thoughts on that one?
You can't put the individual at massive risk either because of increased terrorism.
Anyone? Andrew?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we come back to this thing about the scrutiny and to what extent the British government is, basically acting honourably in this. And I think Joe had a point about, the security services go in and they sort of butter up the government really and basically say we need this information, we need to do things this way. And I thoroughly support what this Home Affairs Select Committee said, that there should be a body scrutinising the intelligence services, which the chair of it comes from the opposition, because that immediately starts to get around that problem. There's structural things we need to do in the UK, like that as an example, just to start addressing this. And I would say we have a very long way to go on it, because we've been caught by the technology and what the security services are doing, moving on far too quickly.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Jane?
Well, it's just an example of what I was saying, that the key thing is to prevent the abuse of power, and if we don't have scrutiny, we don't know whether power is being abused or not, and then it turns out, because Edward Snowden discloses it, that things were going on that none of us had been told. Now, whether that's an abuse of power or not, at least we now know about it, so we can start to discuss it.
But Joe, you would also agree that it's not only preventing the abuse of power, it's also trying to protect the individual, trying to protect society against criminal or terrorist acts.
Yes, well that wouldn't be an abuse.
And exactly. But
so where's the line? This is the question.
Well, the line needs to be...
We don't know about it, we can't discuss it.
But of course, the problem is you can't know about everything or you can't prevent. So there has to be a certain amount of trust as well, a certain level, with a lot of judicial oversight, okay? You need to have the ability that you can protect against criminal acts. So your Liberal colleagues in the Audi group, they've tried to stop the sharing of passenger name records. Now, passenger name records is when the authorities on a transatlantic flight get a list of who's about to get on the aeroplane, so they can double-check those against known criminals. They've tried to stop having that information shared.
They've got a backbone and they don't just do whatever the United States demands. Those passenger lists were demanded by the United States.
And I think they help to protect us all.
Sorry, we've got a point as well from Andrew.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come in with another point, sort of looking to the future and being a bit techie. We're talking at the moment, thinking about individual intelligence officers, going into the data and doing searches. But as the technology moves on, that sort of thing is going to become more and more automated. And you can imagine, programs being written to do that. And I'm sure they already exist, in fact. But sort of AI type programs and so on, which are going to look for particular things. And how do you legislate against that being properly controlled? You're no longer then talking about just a human interaction looking at the data, these huge data sets, but you're talking about automated interaction and searching those data sets. And I don't think we even start to know how to understand that sort of problem and how to legislate for it. But that's the sort of potential we're talking about, and potential for abuse.
Okay. But that's what
sorry, Vicky. We've got a question, so I just want to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
We've done a lot on that. So.
I'd like to ask all the panel a question in the fact that one of the documents released by Edward Snowden from the NSA referred to the FISA court, which is the secret court overlooking the NSA. Their computers actually being monitored by the NSA during the time when FISA were actually assessing the capabilities and the legal requirements of the National Security Agency. So in that situation, you have the legislature actually being monitored by the people who are supposed to be doing the monitoring. Now, this is an American situation. As far as the UK and the GCHQ situation, we just don't know. But I'd like to put it to all of you, are you happy with that situation?
Joe, can we start with you?
Well, I think I've already made it clear that I'm not happy. And it's a question of who guards the guardians, isn't it? But I did want to say also, I mean, in my day job as a lawyer, I see the effect of this kowtowing to what the security services want. If you look in the civil procedure rules, there was an amendment brought in last year, the one I mentioned earlier, where you can actually find that if you're the defendant, say the government decides that you're a danger to national security and wants to get rid of you, you can find you're a defendant in a civil court and you are actually excluded from the trial, and somebody called a special advocate is then appointed on your behalf to go in and argue your case, and you're not entitled to be there or to know exactly what's said. Now, this is what has got my party so upset about that. You remember, it was before the Snowden revelations. We were saying that the national security exception, where the government could say we're not disclosing this evidence for reasons of national security, we were saying that is enough, that is working. They do not want these special rules. These special rules are not justified. I mean, they did want them, but we were saying they shouldn't have them. We have now got them. They are in law. You can find. There are now special barristers who are these special advocates, who are considered security cleared. What is going on here?
Yeah. I wasn't referring to the control of the individual. I was referring to the control of the government.
Well, it's a consequence of the same sort of mindset, if you like. I just think it's appalling that the National Security Agency is doing that. And it makes me think of back in the McCarthy era when, I forget his name, the guy who was head of the FBI. Sorry?
Edgar Hoover.